One of the biggest complexities with older generation handheld gaming hardware is that direct captures can be very difficult, and the Game Boy from Nintendo is one such example. What if you wanted to capture original Game Boy games for streaming or to display on an external device? Well, of course, you have a few options. The first is emulation, either via hobbyist developed or commercial ones like the Nintendo Switch Online service. The second is a clone device such as the Analog Pocket, but even the Pocket out of the box won't let you capture externally unless you have the Pocket Dock, which is an additional $99 on top of the $219 for the Analog Pocket. But now there is an easy, non-invasive and affordable way to capture original Game Boy games to external displays with this product here known as the GB Interceptor. At a high level, simply install the GB Interceptor into your Game Boy, plug in the game, connect the Interceptor to your PC via USB, and then enable your streaming or capture software, and that's it. Very simple and easy. But of course, we are going to dive deeper into the GB Interceptor, how it works, its limitations, and ultimately what makes it so cool. Now before we start, I want to give a huge thanks to GB Studio Central for graciously donating a GB Interceptor for me to take a look at on the channel today. The GB Interceptor was created by hardware engineer Sebastian Stacks, also known as Daikon X on Twitter, and is fully open source. Sebastian has also worked on other open source Game Boy hardware projects, with the most popular being the Wi-Fi cartridge. So if you are looking to construct your own, keep in mind that you'll need to spend some money constructing the hardware itself. There are some mod shops out there that are happy to create one for you, for a charge of course. I ended up picking up a second unit here as you can see, and this one cost me about $35. So let's talk about how this all works then. At a high level, the device sits between the Game Boy hardware and the game to enable external game capture. But let's think about this for a moment. How would this even work? Even without knowledge of the Game Boy hardware, it's fair to assume that the cartridge port itself knows nothing about a video signal at all. So then what sorcery is at play here? Well, as we said, there was no way to intercept a native video signal via the cartridge port, but it is possible to intercept every single Game Boy CPU instruction. This is of course via tapping into the hardware lines of the Game Boy cartridge port. From here, Sebastian's approach is to build an emulator to interpret these instructions and effectively reconstruct a copy of the video RAM. So how does one just build an emulator and slide it in between the game cartridge and the hardware? Well, the GB Interceptor uses a Raspberry Pi Pico to handle this. It's a low power, low cost device that by default runs at 125 MHz. For the GB Interceptor to do its thing, we said that every single instruction must be captured. If the CPU emulation falls behind or misses an instruction, it would likely prove fatal and crash the game. So to ensure that every instruction is emulated and at the same time the Game Boy's video RAM is reconstructed, the Pi Pico is overclocked to 225 MHz, and the PPU emulation is able to reconstruct its own copy of video RAM. And then it sends it over the USB line to your PC and of course displayed via the appropriate capture software or streaming software. The tiny USB protocol was used to handle communications between the device and the PC. This means that there is no driver needed to install on your PC. It just gets detected like any normal webcam and currently runs on Windows and Linux. The second limitation is that the GB Interceptor outputs at a maximum resolution of 160 by 144. Now this isn't the issue. This makes sense as it's the native resolution of the Game Boy. However, the maximum refresh rate that it can output is at 29 FPS. This of course is about half of the native refresh rate of the Game Boy at 59.7 FPS. So why then is this the case? Well, simply put, modern video codecs aren't expecting a 4-color or 2-bit signal at such a low resolution. Most are looking for a 720 or 1080p stream with at least 12 bits of color depending on the codec that's used in hardware, and as such, even with the small amount of RAM needed to construct a single Game Boy image frame, there is no 2-bit color formats that are a standard, and Sebastian was forced to use NV12, or a 12-bit compressed color format to stream the video signal. This uses about 6 times the data, and when used in conjunction with the Pico over USB, its maximum ceiling is 29 frames every second. There's simply not much else that can be done here unless there is a way to stream a 2-bit native signal over USB. With the 29 FPS limitation, I found that some of my capture tools didn't like the GB Interceptor. So for this, I recommend either OBS or VLC, which work quite well. Other tools that I use, such as Amarek TV, which I use for lossless captures, simply did not work, although it does detect the device's resolution and refresh rate in the options. Now, it's important to mention that internally, frames are still captured at their native Game Boy refresh rate of 59.7 FPS. But to compensate for the 29 FPS limitation, Sebastian has provided options to enable two separate blending modes, low and high. These simulate the ghosting of the Game Boy by simply pressing the mode button on the back of the device, and this can enable or disable the blending. Personally, I like the blending low option. The high option to me looks a little off to my eyes. But to be very clear, if you're looking for a native 59.7 FPS capture, unfortunately this is not possible. Another limitation is that Game Boy Color games aren't supported at this time. Because the Game Boy Color has double the clock speed of the original DMG, it means that the emulation layer currently isn't fast enough to keep up processing instructions. However, this is something that potentially could be added in a future update. If there is a way for the emulation to be tightly optimized, this could most definitely open up the door for Game Boy Color games to be running on the GB Interceptor. But let's talk about some good stuff. The GB Interceptor provides two separate color palettes that you can use, the standard green DMG color palette as well as the black and white. And both of these, when applied with point filtering, do look quite sharp on an external display. The second is that the GB Interceptor supports all Game Boy hardware, all original Game Boy hardware I should say, including the Game Boy Advance, Super Game Boy, and even the GB player on the Nintendo GameCube. And I was able to test out the GB Interceptor on my original Game Boy DMG, as you can see here, which ran quite well. Then I moved over to the Game Boy Color, which worked once again. And then finally I tested my Game Boy Advance, which as you can see here works perfectly. But keep in mind, no matter the hardware, you can only run original Game Boy DMG games. Overall, I think the GB Interceptor is a cool device, as long as you're good with its limitations. If you're a streamer or a speedrunner or someone looking to do gameplay captures on original hardware, then this will get the job done for most people. Of course, it's not a direct native capture as emulation has been introduced, but it's a clever way to provide an external video output without having to mod your Game Boy, which can cost hundreds of dollars. And finally, if you want to learn more about the GB Interceptor, how to build your own, or a technical deep dive in some of the challenges that Sebastian overcame, I will leave a link to Sebastian's blog post as well as his YouTube video that outlines every facet of the GB Interceptor and how it was created. So there you have it, folks. That's the GB Interceptor capture device. It's cheap, it's easy, it does have its limitations, of course, and I think that this is the first iteration, and hopefully we'll start to see it improve. I'm hopeful that we'll see Game Boy Color games get added to the Interceptor. Potentially there is some significant code optimizations to allow Game Boy Color games to run, and who knows what the future holds, but this is a really cool piece of kit. Once again, big thanks to GB Central for sending this out to me, as well as Martin Gower for developing this batch of interceptors, and of course for Sebastian Stacks. Without his ingenious work here, none of this would have happened and none of this would be possible. But we're going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.